I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you episode number 71 in this podcast dedicated to the continued investigation into how to better your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. We're going to be following right up in the wake of last week's episode on GABA with an interview into a plant-based nutraceutical, which it turns out can increase the amount of GABA in active use in your brain, something called Lemon Balm. Lemon Balm is the name of the plant. Got pretty little white flowers and grows in Northern Europe and elsewhere, and it's been around forever. And yet when I first heard about it, I assumed it was something that was like a lip maintenance product rather than a plant with cognitive enhancing properties. But it shows how much I know. But that's not important because we've got an expert on Lemon Balm, Professor Andrew Scholey, who's actually a colleague of Professor Con Stow, who you remember we had several episodes ago. They're both at the Swinburne University in Australia. We'll be talking with him in the main interview. If you hang around until the end of the episode, I'm going to point you towards a really interesting piece dealing with concepts of neuroscience, free will, and crime and punishment. But as usual, let's start off with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So researchers at Duke University are doing some stuff straight out of Island of Dr. Moreau, mixing around with the genomes of mice, chimps, and humans in the efforts of figuring out why do humans have such darn big brains? A pretty worthy question, and ever since the Human Genome Project, we've had a pretty good idea of what the human genome looks like, and I guess they've also, in the background with probably less publicity, done the Chimp Genome Project, or at least enough of it to have a pretty good idea of the differences between genes promoting brain development in chimps and of humans. And they've identified several key likely differences in some sections of DNA called enhancers that themselves sort of control the expression of nearby genes on the DNA strand and how those get turned on for protein synthesis. So they looked at enhancers that were likely to control the growth of the cortex, the part of the brain which is conspicuously larger in humans than in other primates, and found several different pieces of enhancer DNA that differed largely between humans and chimps, narrowed that down to 6 candidates and one called HRE5, and they wound up mixing some human enhancer DNA with embryonic mice, and then also some chimp enhancer DNA with different embryonic mice, and seeing the results in the brain development of those mice. And in the battle of the mouse brains, probably not surprisingly, but definitely interestingly, the human DNA won. The embryonic mice that got the human version of the HARE5 enhancer mini gene wound up with brains that were showing the biomarkers for brain growth earlier, more colorfully. They put in colorful blue biomarkers, and they also wound up with brains that were 12% bigger than the mice that received the chimp DNA. They have yet to do testing to see whether these larger brains are actually increasing the intelligence of the mice as those mice grow into adults, but definitely some interesting findings. Now, this might have the aw shucks, what did we actually learn from this? Does this just mean that we know that humans have bigger brains than chimps? Didn't we know that already? But understanding which pieces of our DNA puzzle are most responsible for the promotion of brain growth in fetal mammals is probably a pretty useful thing in our scientific bag of tricks, whether it leads to smarter human embryos in the future or just making a smarter cat or a dog to be a super pet. Either way, I'm in. In the audience interaction department, it's been a pretty busy week, actually. Got a couple more 5-star reviews on the American version of iTunes. I need to check in on the other versions of iTunes, too, and I will definitely follow up on that soon. But Luke James says that he's been listening since day one, and he looks forward to the upcoming podcast series on Know Your Neurotransmitters, and that he'd also love to get some interviews on things related to gerontology. I will mention that here as a reminder to Rhiannon, who puts together so much of the stuff that goes on Smart Drug Smarts, so she can hunt down some aging experts. Thank you so much for the review, Luke. Daxis Hart said, "This is probably my favorite podcast. It's informative, clear, and concise. It's clear that it doesn't require a PhD to follow along, but it's more than just that. It's clear that in every episode there's a table of contents on their website that helps direct me to the valuable parts of the episode, as well as the entire website itself and the app serving as a platform to enhance the user experience, completely optional." Wow, thank you. That is awesome. And really nice that some of these extras that we're doing are getting noticed. That actually brings our grand total of reviews on iTunes up to 90. I feel like we should come up with some sort of silly Ponzi scheme where the remaining 10 reviews to bring us to 100 get put into a drawing for a free face licking by Mimi the cat or something like that. But I'll let that be wild-eyed speculation and merely say that all reviews are very, very much appreciated and help to get the word out about the podcast. I also got an email from a listener. Actually, this was forwarded by way of a Rhiannon, and she's responded and I haven't yet. So it's very possible that the listener might hear this commentary on the episode before I actually reply to the email. And if that's true, I apologize. But he was proposing that we do a group online participation thing very similar to what we did with the water fast a couple of months ago around a ketogenic diet, and have a bunch of people sort of simultaneously dive into the ketogenic diet transition process, experiment, whatever. I'd be super interested in an idea like that. And if that's something that raises positive alarm bells in your head and something that you'd be interested in, definitely drop us an email and just kind of say rah, rah, rah or something so we can kind of get a sampling of people's interest in such an idea. Not saying 100% it's going to happen, but it's certainly not 0% either, so we will move along for now.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So our guest this week is Professor Andrew Scholey, who's the director of the Center for Human Psychopharmacology at Swinburne University in Melbourne, Australia. He's a leading researcher into the neurocognitive effects of natural products, supplements, and food components. We're going to be talking with him today about Lemon Balm, as I mentioned, and we'll almost certainly be talking with him again in the future because he's an expert on a variety of plant-based psychopharmacological substances that will be of interest to us. And so this is just the tip of the Andrew Scholey iceberg. He's a professor of brain and behavioral sciences at Swinburne and co-director of the NICM Collaborative Center for the Study of Natural Medicines and Neurocognition. And he has been chief investigator on national competitive grants from the UK, Europe, and Australia. Clearly, he's a devoted researcher, a big fan of plants, and here we are with what was for me an introduction to Lemon Balm, something I hadn't previously been familiar with.
Lemon balm, or Militia officinalis, to give it its proper botanical name, has a long history of use as a cognitive enhancer. Probably more accurate to call it a mood enhancer or a calming agent. It's appeared in writings about medicine as long ago as 300 BC. And particularly in terms of its potential effects on the nervous system and behavior. So it seems to have a long history as an agent which appears to be effective almost as a sedative, hypnotic type of agent. I've been involved in a number of trials, including the first human trials, to look systematically at the effects. And these seem to bear out its historical use. There's a great quote by Nicholas Culpeper, who was a fairly colourful herbalist who was around in the early 1600s. He said it causeth the mind and heart to become merry, and driveth away all troublesome cares and thoughts out of the mind arising from melancholy. He also said of lemon balm that it takes away grief, sorrow, and care, instead of which it produceth the joy and mirth. So even though it has this historical use, there hadn't been too much really in terms of its cognitive effects in humans. We really started to look at the mood effects because we were getting consistent mood effects in a series of studies that I was involved in, actually conducted by my then PhD student, David Kennedy, who looked at the mood and cognitive effects of a series of herbal extracts, including things like ginseng, sage, and lemon balm. And we found slightly different cognitive effects in terms of memory-enhancing effects, depending partly on the characteristics of the lemon balm we use, which I'll come back to. But we did find consistent mood-enhancing effects. A very standardized extract of lemon balm was a very clear increase in calmness. And what we found was very clear. That was that there was a dose-dependent improvement in calmness following lemon balm. So we gave a placebo and 2 doses of lemon balm, 300 milligrams and 600 milligrams, on different visits. The order in which people got the visits was counterbalanced. The trial was performed double-blind. And what we found was an increase in calmness associated with the highest level of lemon balm, about 600 milligrams. We also got a reduction in alertness. So, that wasn't necessarily a desirable thing, but it was there. There was a significant reduction in alertness at the same dose. And that's the kind of profile that you might find with a typical benzodiazepine like diazepam or Valium. So that was quite interesting. But because of the reduction in alertness, we also quite interested in whether there were impairments in cognitive function.
Did I understand that one correctly, that at the higher dose of 600 milligrams was where the anxiolytic results happened, but it was at the lower dose of 300 where people felt like they were performing better on the test, even though they felt like they were less alert?
Not quite. So the anxiolytic effect occurred with the 600 milligrams, but that included increased calmness and decreased alertness, whereas the lower dose, 300 mg, was associated with improved performance on one of the modules.
But not the feelings of increased calmness?
Absolutely, yes. So it's an interesting finding that comes out of quite a lot of our work, which is that there does seem to be this often a dissociation between mood effects and cognitive effects. And it's not something that I've really managed to resolve. We've tried to attack this from different angles. You know, intuitively, you would think that if something, for example, increased alertness, you would get an improvement in attentional function or maybe memory. But those two can be dissociated. It's very interesting. And I suspect there must be shared neural systems, but also distinct neural systems which underlie the cognitive and mood effects.
It's also really interesting that people feel like perceptually that their alertness is lower, and yet they're performing just as well on the actual test.
That's right, yeah. And there are other pieces of research which support this. So, for example, where people have become fatigued and yet their performance is maintained, for example. And probably what we need to start doing is to look at not just performance and mood, but also looking at perceived effort. So that is how much cognitive resources you have to bring to bear onto a task in order to maintain performance. This idea that, for example, neural efficiency, a great example is actually with polyunsaturated fatty acids, the fish oils and related substances, where what the fMRI data seem to be showing is that what happens is you often don't get a cognitive enhancement when people take fish oils over a long period, but what you do see is a lower level of activation in functional imaging. So the fMRI bold signal is lower. Of course, the whole idea of these trials is to try and find ways in which we can translate them into treatments which might be effective in cognitive aging and dementia and other conditions where cognition is fragile. And so it's quite important to be able to deliver some of these bioactives in ways which are palatable. So rather than giving people capsules or handfuls of capsules to swallow every day where compliance can be quite low, is to actually deliver them in foodstuffs. And just last year I published the culmination of a series of studies where we were looking at the effects of lemon balm delivered in foods. And one of them was in a drink, so in a tea-like substance. And again, we found actually the same kind of anxiolytic effects. And also in a yogurt, we found some improvements there as well.
Lemon balm sounds like it would taste good. I mean, most people like the taste of lemons. Is there a strong taste to it?
It is a sort of lemony kind of herb. Yeah. So unlike a lot of herbals which we know are psychoactive, it's actually, it is reasonably palatable. A lot of these substances are quite bitter. It's just not possible to deliver them in this way. So that was quite promising. And also, I think there has been one trial where people have looked at a lemon balm preparation in Alzheimer's disease. So this wasn't a study that I had any involvement in at all. This was Clive Ballard and Elaine Perry led this in the UK. And it was actually a study looking at agitation in people with Alzheimer's disease. So this trial was applying lemon balm topically, so it was applied to the skin in an oil, and every attempt was made to double blind the trial in that the nurses in the home didn't know what the purpose of the trial was. The patients didn't know, but of course the preparation gave off a distinctive smell, so we can't rule that out. But we also know that some of the actives within lemon balm, some of the sort of organic substances which we believe are active within lemon balm are absorbed through the skin. And this trial showed a very dramatic decrease in the symptoms of agitation. in these Alzheimer's patients. So it does appear that there's a fairly coherent picture emerging from the cognitive effects.
This has been something that people have known about, like you said, since biblical times, and it sounds like it's pretty spectacularly effective in the mood-enhancing qualities. How come this is something that doesn't get more use than it does?
Well, I think, a few things. One is probably a word of caution, which is that these are trials which have shown positive effects, but they are small trials, so typically 30 to 50 people, so they're not huge multi-center trials. So they need to be verified in larger trials, in other labs, of course. So these are sort of a handful of studies which have shown very consistent positive effects on mood. Quite often, this is partly a kind of political issue in that the big pharmaceutical companies can't really make a buck out of plants. The other is actually, again, part of the regulatory landscape, which means that if we publish a positive trial on Lemon Balm, there isn't that much to stop anybody just using those data to market their own product, which may be very different. And it's a huge issue.
When we talked with Constable before about a lot of different plant-based nutraceuticals, that was an issue that came up there as well.
And yeah, before I got involved in this area, I was very skeptical, I have to say. So, I can see where that comes from.
Talk about that a little, because that's interesting to me, just because it's traditional medicine that has been around in some cases, like Ayurvedic herbs that have been around for 3,000 years, that just sort of made you skeptical on the face of it?
I think it was just because of a lack of a good evidence base. It was about 2000 that Dave Kennedy and myself did the first human trial into ginseng. Now, at that point, ginseng was the biggest selling herbal supplement in the world. It was, there was billions of dollars were being traded annually through people selling ginseng for its purported stimulant properties in humans, and yet there hadn't been a single human trial to evaluate whether it actually had any cognitive effects or not. So I guess that's why I was skeptical. And I have to say, over the last couple of decades, it's been a huge portfolio of studies showing benefits, and sometimes not, and I think those are also incredibly valuable studies as well, but often showing that that some of these plants do have the effects that they're used for traditionally. And I think the other side of that is also that in the arena of cognitive function, there is a kind of, because you're changing a psychological state, that perhaps people are better calibrated to evaluate those effects than certain other areas of medicine, if you like.
When you think about Lemon Balm now, would you class it as a cognitive enhancer, given your knowledge of it and intuitions you have, or would you think of it more as a mood enhancer? I think it's both. So going back to the studies that I've been involved in, I think every study we've done has shown this, as you accurately described it, as a sort of anxiolytic effect. So increased calmness, even in the face of a psychological stressor. The cognition enhancing effects are a little bit trickier, a little bit more fragile, and seem to depend a lot more on the extract. In one study that Kennedy and myself undertook years ago, what we did was took a number of different extracts of lemon balm, and then we collaborated with somebody who looked at their binding properties on human brain tissue. We basically looked at the two main targets, two receptors for the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which is, I'm sure you know, is the neurotransmitter which is decimated in Alzheimer's disease. The minority of people who do respond to treatment, the drug treatment for Alzheimer's disease, are treated by upgrading their cholinergic system's activity through an enzyme pathway. So another way is to try and bind the neurotransmitters. So we were interested in the two subtypes of neurotransmitters, so the nicotinic receptors and the muscarinic receptors, and there are well-defined test tube, in vitro test tubes
test for these, which we did, and found a couple of lemon balms from our 8 different sets. So they all had various levels of binding to the nicotinic and muscarinic receptors. And we then compared the extract with the highest nicotinic and muscarinic binding with the extract with the lowest. And what we found was that in both cases, they improved calmness. So we could say that this mood enhancing effect was independent of any cholinergic activity, whereas only the extracts with the high level of cholinergic binding also had this cognition enhancing effect, where it also improved memory.
We just did an episode on the neurotransmitter GABA. The anxiolytic effects from lemon balm, is that related to an increase in GABA within the brain?
Yes, increased binding of GABA, we think. So we know that various components of lemon balm appear to bind the GABAergic receptor, or the GABA receptor rather. So it does seem to be, we think that the anxiolytic effects are due to its GABA activity. And I'm just at the moment planning some studies where we're looking at some brain imaging to see if we can confirm that, because it is possible now to look at GABA activity in the living human brain using magnetic resonance spectroscopy, which we're hoping to do over the next year or so.
Something I didn't ask earlier, what part of the world does lemon balm naturally grow in?
Well, it grows pretty much everywhere, but particularly in Northern Europe, it just grows like a weed.
And are there any known physical downsides? Is there anything bad to say about lemon balm?
Like everything, I think that anything taken in excess can cause negative effects. As I said, in our initial study, we did find a reduction in alertness, although that wasn't accompanied by cognitive deficits. But I would guess that in excess it could possibly cause kind of drowsiness.
But there's not a dangerous LD50 where you eat 2 pounds of it and it's going to make you drop over dead or anything like that?
Not that I've heard of. I would imagine you'd probably vomit before you could eat enough to cause that kind of adverse event. And again, probably because the psychoactivity is probably the result of effects on multiple systems.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very, very much to Professor Scholey for his time on this interview. Do not be surprised, as I said, if we hear from him again in the not terribly distant future. He's also done a ton of research into things like ginseng and Bacopa monnieri and other substances that would not be a surprise to you on a visit to your supplement shelf in your favorite health food store. It really struck me as we were talking some of the difficulties that are necessarily involved with doing research into these plant-based substances where we don't have it distilled down to one particular active ingredient the way that you do in a purely pharmaceutical intervention. And you kind of think, well, okay, something like, is ginkgo? It's the same species, yes, but it's just the understatement of the year to think that because 2 organisms are members of the same species that they're necessarily going to have the same effect on you. I'll take the stupid example of a dog, but a Chihuahua is a dog and so is a pit bull. And if you're locked in a room with an angry Chihuahua and an angry pit bull, you're going to have 2 very different experiences. And as silly as that sounds, I think it kind of clarifies some of the inherent difficulty in really scientifically attacking the questions of what are these plant-based substances going to do to me if I use them. No easy answers to those questions, or at least no cheap answers as far as research dollars, but it's great that scientists like Dr. Scholey and his colleague Con Stow are making forays in this field.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So I got to admit, I've started reading The Atlantic magazine with increasing fanaticism because they've got some really solid articles in there. There was one in a recent online edition by neuroscientist David Eagleman entitled The Brain on Trial. And I'm not going to try to synopsize the whole article here, but I just kind of wanted to point everybody in that direction. I thought it was a really, really interesting article touching on law and morality and free will, crime and punishment, and highlighting how a lot of the things that society very rightly reacts in a punishment direction towards, if somebody murders somebody, rapes somebody, molests somebody, all the stuff that are long-standing horrible antisocial behaviors that make us want to bring down the hammer on people are oftentimes totally based in morphological brain problems that are like you've got a tumor in something that's exciting your amygdala and turning you into a violent raving monster in a way that has nothing to do with human choice or rational decision making, and that really sometimes the perpetrators of horrible crimes are themselves victims of biology in ways that, if you kind of step back and think about it, is just terribly unfortunate, and it makes double victims both of society and the people themselves that perpetrate these crimes. And anyway, this article is thinking about, now that we have the science becoming available to at least identify the root causes, the root biological causes that sometimes lead to antisocial behavior, how should that instruct the way that society deals with people in the future in a way that keeps society safe but isn't futilely tormenting an already tormented creature that really has something wrong with its brain? Anyway, a very worthy read, and we will have a link on the website. I'd also like to throw out a public thank you to listener and now Smart Drug Smarts participant Garrett Wisbaum, who kind of appeared out of the digital mists a few weeks ago and said, "Hey, Jesse, I've got a couple of weeks before my full-time job starts. I love the podcast. I've been listening for a long time, and I'd love to get involved in any way I can." And really, really sharp guy, and has been helping us out a bunch in a bunch of different ways that will benefit the whole Smart Drug Smarts community in the not-distant future. So he wanted to give a public backslapping and praise and all that stuff to Garrett. Thank you so very, very much.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Okay, that is the entire episode. Thank you for hanging around until the end. If you're still here, I've got to imagine you kind of like the podcast, and if you do, then you should tell some other friends about it, because hey, that's how people find out. Next week, there is the very real possibility that we'll be hearing from a man who's performed over 500,000 EEG brain readings. So 500,000 brains at your disposal next week, or at least probably the week after. There's no telling. You never know what you're going to get on Smart Drug Smarts, but it will definitely involve brains. The show notes for this episode, as with all episodes, will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com, including all the relevant links, and I will be back at you next Friday, same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great weekend, have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.